Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Sent Churches Sending Churches webinar. I'm your host, Tomy Wilkerson, and I am so honored. I get the privilege to be able to interview someone who's become a really good friend of mine over the years, Mr. Ben Connelly. So this webinar is in support of the ebook that Exponential just released, I learned, just last night. So if you're on this, know that the book that accompanies this webinar is available to you on Amazon, and you can also go to exponential.org and access it for free. So the subtitle of this webinar and this book is a step-by-step guide to help your church create a vision and culture of multiplication. So if you are watching this webinar or you are sitting in on it, I'm assuming that you are here because you want to see your church multiply. You don't just want to see that church multiply. You want to see the churches that your church multiplies also multiply. You believe that one day that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea, and you recognize that the church is an instrument to seeing that vision become a reality, and you yearn for it. But maybe for whatever reason, whether it's money or size or the age of your church, you're unsure if your church is ready or has the resources to be able to do it. And if you're wondering if that's even possible for you, this webinar is exactly where you should be. You're in the right place. And so we've been praying. We're praying this conversation blesses you, it blesses your community. And I'm just so excited. I'm excited because Ben is incredible. So, just a word about Ben, and I'll hand it over to him to sort of explain his book a little bit. Just a word about him. Ben Connelly is a pastor, he's an author, he's an equipper. He serves everyday disciples, ministry leaders, and church planters across the world through the Equipping Group, which I get the privilege of being on the board for. But also, in addition to that, he helps lead Salt and Light Community and Plant Fort Worth in Fort Worth, Texas. So, on top of having contributed to several books that you can find all over the place, he is a practitioner. So if you pick up the book, you'll find his story in there a little bit, but just a brief word on it. Back in 2009, he and his wife Jess, with some family and friends, started the City Church in Fort Worth, Texas, back in 2009. And they started with about 20 people in a friend's living room. And that church, went on in the course of the next few years to plant four different churches just from being in that living room. And I mean, they grew, of course, but not like thousands of people. Never a huge budget, never a huge staff team, but still blessing, sending, commissioning people all the same. And then in 2020, they sent out another group of people, and that group of people included Ben and his wife Jess and their family, and that's what Salt and Light is. And so he's overseen multiple church planting organizations and church planting efforts. He has taught university classes and seminary classes, and also, just as if that wasn't enough, he and his wife have also fostered short-term kids for different periods of their life. So Ben is even more personally than that. I just have the utmost respect for Ben as a human being. Just one of the kindest, gentlest, humblest, most gracious people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know. And so, Ben, I'm excited for you to sort of say a little bit about your book. So I'll hand it over to you to talk about your book, its purpose, and all the things.
All of that is very, very kind. If you don't know Tomy Wilkerson, he's one of the most honoring people and says overly nice things about folks, and I'm honored that he considers me a friend. So, um, of the things that Tomy said, the thing that resonates most as he was talking about it is I'm at best an imperfect practitioner trying to foster some discipleship among a local group of everyday followers of Jesus here in Fort Worth. And so all the other things are just grace upon grace upon grace. But I love thinking about discipleship. I love being in a room when God turns a light bulb on for folks, whether it's someone coming to know Jesus for the first time and that ultimate light bulb, um, or a leader who realizes they have a place and a role in God's kingdom, or maybe poignantly for this conversation, someone who realizes that their church actually can play a role in God's history-long, globally wide vision for multiplication. And so that's what I'm excited to talk about today. And my prayer coming into this has been that everyone here, whether you think you can, think you can't, have done it for multiple generations, or just stepping into ministry. My prayer is that everyone here can see their place in God's vision and mission of multiplication. Um, so To Tommy's question, that's what the book is about. It starts with this idea um, that every healthy thing that God created is designed to multiply. And so we can often think of mission starting in Jesus's Great Commission, go make disciples of all nations. We can think of it starting in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, of you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. But if we look at God's heart for multiplication, we find it all the way back in Genesis chapter 1. And so, not just his command to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, but even before that, healthy ferns were created with seeds in them to multiply according to their own kind. Healthy giraffes made new healthy giraffes. Healthy humans made new healthy humans. And so, if that's true, we can spiritualize the pattern and see throughout history and throughout Scripture that healthy disciples are going to make new disciples. Healthy groups and leaders are going to make new groups and leaders. Healthy churches are going to be part of God's plan for starting and sending new churches. And it's worth saying, unhealthy things multiply as well. Cancer multiplies. Deranged cells can multiply, and so we acknowledge that. There's a lot of darkness trying to multiply across the earth, and so we get to be part of pushing that darkness back as we play our role in multiplication. So that's the starting point for the book, and then what we just try to do is build out the idea of if that's true, if that theologically is true, if that's true of everyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus, then it starts with our churches, our organizations, our groups having a vision for multiplication. There's a lot of things that our churches and organizations are called to have a vision for. Have a vision for gospel preaching, have a vision for care, have a vision for groups, have a vision for next generation. There's all of these really good things. And it can be easy for multiplication, replication, sending to get lost. And so we try to recapture the idea of what it can look like for every church to prioritize sending as at least part of their vision. And then from there, we play out culture because every decision we make in our church, this is true for sending as well as everything else, but everything we do in our church either works for our vision or it accidentally works against our vision. And so considering the different elements of our church's culture and the things we call people to and the language we use and the priorities we have and the way we spend our time and the way we spend our budgets, all these things um, is part of a culture of multiplication, a culture of sending. And then we just get more and more tangible as we go along. So the step-by-step reality is maybe a little bit of a misnomer because every single church has a unique next step and a unique step after that based on your specific mission field and your vision. But if there's not a vision and not a culture and not a preparation and not other forms of sending within your church, then the reality is we'll never send from our churches, either new churches or missionaries. So we try to flesh out some of what that can look like for any church so that your church can have a step-by-step process to sending church planters and missionaries.
I love that. And there's so many things that you say in the book that, I mean, I'm gonna butcher it. I actually had a list of quotes from the book on a different page, and so I should have opened that up before this. But I remember one of the things that sort of immediately grabbed me when I was reading the book and sort of revisiting it, even for this conversation, is, you talk about sort of the lineage, the legacy, the heritage, the genealogy of churches and church planting, and how like every church that gets planted, I mean, it came from somewhere, kind of this multiplication idea, and sort of I don't know, the privilege, the honor, the role, responsibility that we have in sort of continuing that genealogy and moving forward. And I want to explore that a little bit. Like, I can't remember exactly who said it. I don't think you had said it. You were quoting somebody else, just this idea of like, or maybe you did say it, that like, Spurgeon talks about every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. And then I think you say, like, in the same way that that's true, every church planter, or every church is meant to be a church planting church and is supposed to be a multiplying church. And so I want to explore that a little bit, like the theological, historical basis for being a sending church. And so I'd love for you to sort of get into that with us a little bit.
Yeah, you bet. Well, if it sounded wise, I was probably quoting someone else. So we'll give someone else credit for that. But yeah, I mean, I think of Grace Church in Aledo, Texas, is about half an hour from where we live, and Grace Church in Aledo was planted out of Grace Church in Benbrook, Texas. which was planted out of the Paradox Church in Fort Worth, Texas, which was planted out of City View Church in North Fort Worth, which came from the Village Church in Flower Mound, which has a whole history and a lineage that they've actually done a really good job of tracing back to the early 1800s. And so, in the same way as Ancestry.com and that kind of stuff can be very popular and very intriguing, every church has a family tree. Um, and if we had the ability, we could trace it all back to those first disciples in Jerusalem who were told, "Don't go until the Spirit falls, but then when the Spirit falls, go be my witnesses." And man, none of our churches would have existed. None of our churches would exist today if not for the faithfulness of that first generation of Jesus's followers, and then every subsequent generation who all said, "We're not the last one. We're not the last missionaries to be sent to this place. We're not the last church that needs to be planted either in this city or at the ends of the earth." And so the bold risk, the sacrifice, none of our churches would exist if generations of church leaders before wouldn't have taken those steps. And so there's even, if I can say that, I don't think we said this in the book, but there's even a little bit of an arrogance if we decide, like, no, we're probably the last one. Um, I don't need to sacrifice like somebody else sacrificed. In a similar way as, Paul exhorts Timothy as far as making disciples and raising up leaders, what you've received from others, pass along, and then they may pass along. There's a little bit of that we have to embrace as we're just one step in a process that must continue until Jesus calls us home or until he returns. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, you can keep going if you had more to say with that. I just was thinking it triggered some things else in me, but you can keep going if you had more to say.
Well, I'm curious to know what it triggered, but now we're gonna have this awkward standoff of silence. So, what did it trigger in you, Tomy?
No, it just reminded me of the conversation that we were talking about, even sort of in preparation for this webinar, right? Like you use the story of the church in Antioch as sort of this opening image, this core idea that sort of traces throughout the book, and then how that church, that city, doesn't even exist anymore. Yet we're, like you said, we're products of it. Our churches are products of it, and you even just being in Turkey recently, I just would love for you to, I don't know, explore that too. I mean, that might be in conjunction with what you were going to say. And so feel free to continue or disregard and go with what you're going to say. The floor is yours.
It's in conjunction with what I was going to say now, even if it wasn't. So, yeah, I had the honor of being in Turkey the first part of this year. We were meeting with some global leaders from the Soma network of churches, and we were in Antalya, which is mentioned in the Bible. The apostle Paul preached in Perga and then went to Antalya and took a boat home, and that's how he ended his first missionary journey. And our host there took us on a tour of the ruins of Perga. And it is a city in ruins, like so many ancient Roman and Greco-Roman cities. And yet, even in the ruins, there is this tiny little chapel, and truly, like I'm in probably like a 13 by 13 foot room. If you're watching from overseas, I don't know what that is in meters, but the whole chapel was maybe one and a half times the size of this room. It was this tiny little gathering place for Christians, and there was still a cross in the carved stone there. And it reminded me, it was after this book was done, but it reminded me of the image that Tomy just mentioned, um, that little chapel in Pergay doesn't exist anymore. The whole city's in ruins again. But there were faithful followers of Jesus there 2,000 years ago, who were then sent out from Pergay to go somewhere else. And the image of the church at Antioch, which we know sent out Paul and Barnabas, we can kind of call it history's first sending church. Similar to the chapel in Pergay, the church at Antioch does not exist anymore. And yet both like the tradition of Eastern Orthodoxy and Western what became Catholicism and that kind of stuff would both trace their heritage back to the church at Antioch. And so really there's this question of legacy that we have to wrestle with of what do we want to leave behind? And if the church at Antioch, for example, or the church at Pergay, or Salt and Light Community in Fort Worth, Texas, that started in 2021, if our highest and best is to go, hey, we've got a 40, 80, maybe 120 year ministry in front of us, let's try to be the biggest, best, fastest growing, make all the charts and that kind of stuff, make all the top 10 lists. If that's our highest and best, then praise God, we'll have a legacy that lasts for a moment in history. But the church at Antioch said there's a better legacy. We're going to raise up some of our best. We're going to send out some of our best. And I'm saying that I have to believe Paul and Barnabas were among the best that the church at Antioch had. And they said, we're going to send some of our best. And because of that, from Antioch came the church at Colossae and the church across the Roman Empire and that kind of stuff. And just thinking through the better legacy um, of a church that doesn't exist anymore. In a couple generations, Salt and Light won't exist anymore. If it does, it'll have different leaders. But what I would love to see is to see disciple making leaders sent out from Salt and Light, even if Salt and Light kind of stays anonymous and small and doesn't seem to have a big splash and doesn't make any top whatever lists. I would love to see our legacy being a church that sends some of our best to new places for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom, and see that be the name that lasts for all of history, way more than Salt and Light communities in Fort Worth, Texas.
Wow. You're speaking my love language right to the core of my beliefs and philosophy, and so love this. And probably partially why I'm on the board, I suppose, of the equipping group,
That's right.
aside from your good looks and your charm, although that is also
It's
very palpable and evident.
very kind.
Um,
I feel a lot of pressure because my boss is interviewing me basically right now. So let me turn the tables though for a sec, Tomy, because I mean the underground. Tomy's a leader in Tampa Underground. I mean this is part of your heartbeat too. So even the idea of microchurch. I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I'm going to interview you instead. Part of the idea of microchurch is like you're not pursuing some benchmark size before a microchurch sends out a new microchurch, that kind of stuff. And so you said there's a shared heartbeat there. Tell me a little bit about how that works, because I think one of the big pushbacks on all this is like, well, we don't have enough people to send churches out. We don't have enough resources to send churches out. So how's that work in the microchurch world?
Yeah, I mean, with microchurches, I guess every microchurch is different. Every network is different. I think part of what resonates with me is you sort of talk about things going away, but sort of legacy continuing. I mean, that's sort of how we even talk about the underground itself. It's like we don't really care if people know anything about the underground. We're totally fine if Jesus says, you know, it's time, like close this thing down. You guys have served your purpose. Like it's fine because it's always been about trying to be faithful and obedient to Jesus and being radically in love with him. And so if he says hang it up, we'll happily hang it up. And for us, we're totally fine with no one knowing anything about the underground. Like what I find fascinating and what I love most, my favorite thing about sort of our network, um, is that, yeah, people often don't know the underground, but they come in contact with the microchurches of the underground often. So they might not know me, but they know John from the well, or they know Derek and June from Gingerbeard Cafe and all these other places, and then they find out, oh, the Timothy Initiative is connected to you guys. Whoa,
Mhm.
you guys are connected to these people, and it's this whole thing that no one knows anything about. To me, that's just fun.
Yeah.
And I guess in terms of like multiplication and all that, really, it's about calling. Like, in terms of the underground you know, part of what I love about microchurches too is that they sort of recognize they can't actually be everything to everyone. Like
Mhm.
you're a small group of people, and so you kind of just sort of have to pick your lane. Like, what's the thing that you're going to do? And as you do that, you realize, okay, actually, we're trying to love this group of people faithfully, and we're serving them this way, but also this program needs to exist, or this approach needs to happen, and maybe somebody in that group feels that call or feels the pull, and then it's, yeah, we bless you, we send you. We're always trying to help people cultivate calling and stir the question of, well, who has God actually burdened you for? And yeah, to the best we can, incubate that so that they can then be faithful in that calling. Because, yeah, like you mentioned, darkness is also growing and multiplying. And so we can't afford to hold on to people forever. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about that. But I mean, even going back to you, flipping it back to you, you know, yeah, I think what I appreciate even about sort of your posture in the book is that you're willing to admit, like, hey, we're not. we weren't perfect. We weren't perfect at this. We're still not. There's plenty of mistakes that we've made. And even as you have also consulted and coached other leaders in the area of church planting, I'd love to sort of get underneath that too. Like, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen well-intentioned churches make when they try to send leaders? And I mean, you address some of that in the book, so I'd love for you to unpack even why you get into that so directly in the book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and we have, a lot of what we've learned the hard way. And so, if there is a step-by-step guide, it's a step-by-step guide of what not to do from from all of our mistakes. So, um, yeah, I think the biggest mistake that I remember our church is making, as we've sent out church planters, is kind of the out of sight, out of mind.
Mhm.
And so we celebrate and we talk about the coming send, we commission and bring the core team up and that kind of stuff and send them off. And then in part because tyranny of the urgent, like, oh man, now we got to backfill all these spaces and we got to, get kind of back on track. We our first couple of sends, not sins, but sends, first couple send outs. Um, we kind of just forgot about him. Didn't talk about him after that. Didn't keep in great contact. Rarely celebrated that kind of stuff. And in a sense, it felt like later, looking back on it, it felt like sending a kid off to college and then like basically cutting him off from the family, and losing all the relationship. And of course, the relationship changes, but there's still a relationship there. But backing up the truck even more, I think one of our biggest first mistakes we made is not preparing our church for the heartache of that.
Mm.
And so again, to follow the image, we we don't have college kids yet, but from friends who do, uh, it's an exciting moment, but it also changes the family dynamic. And if we have three kids right now, and if one of them disappears, then a third of our kids are gone, and that vastly impacts the family dynamics. And Charlotte's our oldest, so we will miss Charlotte when she goes off to college, I believe. Um, and so we didn't prepare for the kind of heartache side of it, for the loss. Um, and I wonder if that's some of the Christian tradition we have in the West, that everything has to look positive. And, even if someone's going through a bad day, it can be such a cliche thing to be like, well, it's a good thing God is sovereign and good. It's like, yeah, I do believe he's sovereign and good, but also this can suck. And there's brokenness in the world and, relational distance, even for a really good reason. We're called to intimacy. We're called to be together. And so even if it's for a good thing, it can hurt to lose some of our friends. We sent out elders who, for years we'd wrestled with, issues and shepherding and had, good fights and redemption and that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh man, that was a really good friend. He's gone now and gone for a really good reason, but I still miss him. And some of our biggest givers and some of our best, small group leaders and this kind of stuff. And so I think one of the mistakes we can make as we look at the positive side of look what's going forward, God's kingdom is going forward, we can miss like the personal side of things of like even for good reasons that people are leaving, it's still gonna leave a hole.
Mm.
So I think those are a couple of the mistakes we've made. Every time we send out someone, we make another mistake, but those are a couple of them that come to mind.
Yeah, no. And I remember that being a part of the book that also really sort of grabbed my attention because of course we talk about reasons why people don't send out from their churches, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Whether that's I mean, you talk about being enough and feeling like you're not enough and sort of how that materializes in money and staff and yeah, expertise. But
Yeah.
then to sort of say, but there's also this emotional piece that we don't really talk about very much in multiplying churches. That is also a reality that maybe also sometimes prevents us from sending people. And so I really appreciated that perspective in the ebook, and I imagine that people who are reading it and will read it will also appreciate that as well. And so
Yeah,
going
we have
back
to have
to, oh, go
some.
for it.
Sorry. I was gonna say we just have to have some permission to feel sad when our friends leave, and maybe even just putting it out there gives us some permission to feel both, the both and world. Like two things can be true at the same time. Like I'm excited for this person to live into their calling. I'm excited to see their gifts influence and see disciples made in a new place. And also I miss my friend, and we can give permission to feel both those things at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So would you say there's a policy or practice that maybe that you've seen that accidentally, just like not even purposely, but just like accidentally sort of contradicts or undermines a church's stated sending vision?
Yeah, I think it can be stated in different ways. But I think the biggest hindrance to sending out, I say that intentional, I'll come back to why in a minute. I think the biggest hindrance for a church sending out is a degree of control, and a degree that of professionalism that says there's only a few of us who are good enough to do whatever ministry in the church. And so the more there is a tightness around who's allowed to do things within the church, the more hindrance there's going to be from sending folks out of the church. And so things like if there's only a few folks who are ever able to teach on a Sunday, what if there's other gifted teachers, but because of this tight knit control, they never get to thrive in their giftings? Well, then they're never certainly gonna get to experience that and grow in those giftings to the point where God might have them teaching, either within your church, God's church, or in a different expression, or shepherds. If we're not giving permission, if we're not bringing folks along with us as quote unquote church leaders, um, then we're failing to do our job of equipping the saints for the work of ministry. Um, and and frankly, I get it. Like I've been in local church leadership, paid ministry for 26 years. Um, and there's moments where I'm like, this would be a lot easier if I just did it myself.
Mm.
It'd go a lot quicker if I just did it myself. Frankly, this is going to be arrogant, but I like the way that I do things more than I like the way other people do things. I'm sure I'm the only one on the webinar who likes the way I do things more than the way other people do. Um, but there's a short-term loss, long-term gain mentality that we miss out on if we just continue to do everything ourselves. It does take longer. Something might fall through the cracks. But if we're not bringing people along and helping them find and thrive in their giftings, and if we're not sending in quote unquote smaller ways, I don't know if that's the right word, but within our church, if we're not multiplying groups within our church, if we're not raising up and sending out leaders for ministries within our churches, um, then we're not creating the long runway, and we're not creating the kind of stair-stepped reality that it takes to one day send from our church, send missionaries or church planting teams from our churches. There's a church that I got to work with once. And so we've never done any of this before, but we want to plant a church next year. How do we get there? And in playing out the reality, they had a very strong centralized staff team. I believe in staff for the records. I believe in like there being some testing and improving of leadership. So I don't want to swing the pendulum too far. But it really is only like four to five people in their church that ever got to do anything, whether it be teaching or um, shepherding or leading groups or studies. And these 4 or 5 people were exhausted because they were doing everything. And they flew under the banner of the 80-20 rule. Well, there's only a few of us who are stepping up, and some of that was true, but it was also a self-fulfilling prophecy of they never created the avenues for
Mm.
other leaders to step up. And so the 80-20 rule is always going to be in existence if the 20% hang on to the 80% of work and won't give any away. Um, and so I think that's a massive accidental, to use your word, and I think it is accidental for the most part, an accidental but controlling reality that keeps us from sending is on the most base level. We can accidentally hinder people from discovering and using and thriving in their gifts within our ministries. And if that doesn't happen, there'll never be the opportunity for folks to thrive in a way outside of one specific organization or body of believers.
Yeah. I want to get into maybe even some tangible, some practical, some things that people can sort of walk away with even from this webinar as they're looking into the book. But maybe before that, just briefly, I mean, you kind of are getting at this already in this sort of short-term, long-term trade-off that people are kind of making with some of their decisions and around sending. I'd love for you just even briefly, just like you kind of argue in the book that churches shouldn't wait for size or stability or longevity before sending. And so I want to figure out a little bit just like what's the cost of waiting and what have you seen happen when churches start earlier? So, I mean, that church, I mean, first of all, City Church wasn't very large, still sent people pretty early. The church that you're talking to now that you just mentioned, they're like, we want to plant a church next year. So like people are trying to move rapidly. So I'd just love to explore that briefly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think some of it too, to bridge from the last question to this question, there's also this, and I'm in North Texas, so I might see this more than anyone else, but there's this like bigger, better, faster, stronger mentality in the church that is like that's what wins. And so some of what we're talking about today immediately just flips that on its head. If you're going to send people out, you're actively working against becoming the biggest church in town. And so there is a question in our hearts and minds and balance sheets of like what is the metric we're aiming at. And so bigger, better, faster, stronger, getting the most leaders, getting the most people in the door. I'll use exponential language. If being a level 3 church is the highest and best, then we're not going to do this because this flips that script on its head and says no. Like we want people to please go to the level 4, level five language. And I always chuckle when I think of the please go because there's people in every church that we're like, man, I wish they would leave. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about again sending our best, the Paul and Barnabases, and the men and women who are the best. Um, but yeah, my good friend Chris Freeland leads one of the larger churches in Fort Worth, and we were together yesterday. We had our Plant Fort Worth annual conference to try to see collaboration for the sake of our city, which again takes all of us laying down some of our priorities for the sake of the gospel going forward. Um, but I was reminded, Chris told a group of planters a couple years ago we're sitting in a room in his church, and it's got a large footprint. And a planter was talking about this idea of multiplication and said, like, maybe one day when we're the size of doxology, then we could plant a church. And Chris, very humbly, very gently, he's a great guy. He just kind of goes, hey, with respect, our church happens to be larger. God has graced our church with some growth. He goes, but it's not like we have this extra storehouse of money just sitting around. It's not like we have this like uh, excess of leaders who are just waiting in the wings,
Mhm.
going, man, I wish I had a place to play here. He's like, we're called to steward whatever God has given us, and so we try to use every dollar of our budget for the ministry that God's called us to and the missions has called us to. And every leader that comes through our door, every person that comes through our doors, we take our calling seriously to help them thrive in ministry. And so it's not like you're going to ever get to this place of just having storehouses of excess and then go, oh, I guess we'll use all this for the sake of planting a church. Um, and there's something in that mindset um, that is really helpful to say, like, hey, even if we're starting to from day one of our church to tuck away $10 a month toward a future plant.
Mhm.
Uh, or to start praying, God, where would you have our little church send a household or a planting team, um, and just starting to inculcate that in the vision, in the culture from day one, and maybe years before you do anything. But it guards against waiting until there's this somehow magical day that we think is going to come, where it's like, oh, all of a sudden now we've drifted into being ready.
Mhm.
Um, there's never a ready. Uh, but if we start to drip that stuff into our culture from earlier on, then in small ways we're farmer imagery in the scriptures. We're going out into the field and we're plowing the field and we're digging out the weeds and we're planting little seeds and may not see the fruit of those seeds that we plant for years to come. But the earlier on, the better the crop's going to be, the better the harvest is going to be. Um, and Chris has even said, like, when they started to cast this vision for sending, it felt to many people like a bait and switch
Mhm.
because they hadn't done any of that. And so as they started to talk about missions more and started to talk about campuses and church plants and this kind of stuff, because that had not been baked into the culture under the previous leadership, um, all of a sudden it felt like whiplash to them, like this is brand new. And so I think the small the small or even earlier from day one, or if you're 64 years old as a church, then starting tomorrow, if you've never done this before, like starting in the smallest of ways to plant those seeds, trusting the Lord's timing and trusting that He's going to bear the fruit, is going to produce a lot more good than just waiting for one day when you think you're big enough, rich enough, have enough leaders to backfill, have enough staff to backfill whatever it is. Because I wonder if that's a lie from the enemy to tell you have to wait for that. I don't think any church ever gets to that day where they're like, look at all these excess people we have. Look at all this excess gold we have laying around. Let's plant a church. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, some of the stuff that you've already mentioned, even in that last conversation, it sets us up great for the question that I was going to ask you. I mean, you mentioned some steps in your book, ways that people can sort of be creating this culture within their church of sort of, I don't know, wanting, desiring, preparing for multiplication. And I just come back to, Jesus talking about people being faithful with the small things, the little things, they get rewarded with more. And so even those people who are listening to this that are maybe their church is 50 to 150 people and they have a super small staff and no missions pipeline. I mean, kind of as you have journeyed with churches and have done this yourself, I mean, what would you say is a first realistic step that people can take in the next 30 days that you'd recommend taking
Yeah.
to sort of move towards this culture and this heart?
Yeah. Yeah, I think of, if it's an existing church, if that's the scenario you're setting up, I'm going to nerd out with you for a minute. There's
Bring it.
an aspect of change management that says
Yeah, John
people don't do
Cotter.
stuff either because they don't know, they don't have the knowledge for it, they don't have the capacity for it, or they don't have the desire for it. And so there is a real first step for some of our churches of instilling some of the knowledge. And so even starting with things like God's heart for multiplication. Maybe we talk about multiplying disciples, but we don't extrapolate that out to talk about multiplying groups or leaders or churches or this kind of stuff. So there can be a knowledge gap. That the first step could be going, well, let's talk about the theology of multiplication. Let's go back to Genesis 1 and see, like, since the beginning, God has made all of creation with the idea of multiplication baked into it. So maybe a first step for you is to fill some of the knowledge gap. Um, Maybe it's a capacity gap. The reality is every church and every leader has 24 hours in a day and has a budget of a certain size, and we all wish the budget was bigger. But one of the things we do in our multipliers learning communities that I get to help lead through Exponential, shout out learning communities, you should all do them. Um, but one of the things we talk about is capacity and going, with the small amount of dollars that any church has in our budget, if it all goes toward things that bring people in, or if it all goes toward maintenance, or if it all goes toward um, just care and shepherding what already exists, which again, they're all good things. But then there's no dollars left over for things like meeting with a young leader. And so what would it look like? Maybe a first step for someone who has the knowledge, but is going, how do I do this? Is just to set aside some time, because that's part of capacity, some money to meet with someone, or to put on a small a young emerging leader cohort or that kind of stuff, and just to say this is important. And so I want to meet with folks who I think have some raw material, but they haven't developed it yet. And so what it would look like to take some of our capacity and make sure that we're shifting it toward multiplication. And then desire is the final piece. If you've created some knowledge around something, if you've created some capacity around something, then if we're honest, it's a heart check. And maybe for some of us, the first step is looking at our hearts and going, why is it that I have such a hard time giving away leadership? Why is it that I have such a hard time thinking, man, if somebody else teaches on a Sunday or counsels without me being in the room, why do I find myself being jealous of accolades they get? Or why do I find myself feeling insecure that they might be better at something than I am? And so there is some desire that has to exist for this to take place. And if it doesn't start from the quote unquote top, Jesus is the head of his church, but for most of us, we have a leader or leadership teams. And if the leadership team doesn't have the knowledge, capacity, and desire, then there's no way the rest of the organization will. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I think those, there's a lot of exercises. In fact, we created a lot of exercises to accompany this book to try to help teams put these principles into practice. And so I think there's a lot of those kind of things that could be a first step. But to summarize them, I think the first step would be either check the desire, check the capacity, or check the knowledge. And whichever one of those is the most deficient, what would it be like to infuse some knowledge, infuse some capacity, infuse some desire? And if you don't know how to do that, man, Exponential is a great organization. Underground's a great organization. The equipping group is a okay organization. I like it a lot. But we'd be happy to come alongside you and help infuse some of that desire, capacity, or knowledge if you don't know how.
I love that. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. Just a reminder that is open and available to people as you're watching. We've gotten a few reactions already. So if you have questions that you would like to potentially have us answer, you can go ahead and drop that. So just a reminder to that. But going back to the book, obviously it's just come out through Exponential, and I keep referencing it. It really is a gem, and I do value it and treasure it a lot. And so. I guess maybe as I'm thinking about the audience and people who will watch this later, I mean, what's an idea from sent churches, sending churches that you think could quietly but radically change how local churches operate if leaders took it seriously? So I just would love for you to sort of, I don't know, speak to that for a second.
Yeah. Um, I hope there's a few ideas that could change how we operate. I think we talked about some, even the idea of starting to share things, giving away some of the responsibility, looking at younger leaders, and maybe even looking at younger leaders or emerging leaders not as like the next generation of church leaders, but if they're in your midst, they're a current, maybe a latent generation, but they're a current generation of church leaders. And so, what would it look like to pour into them? Maybe you're not giving away authority before they're ready, but you're at least giving away tasks. And if they do well with little, then giving them some more, giving away some responsibility. And the parable of the talents, it's a story, but in the story, Jesus tells the landowner gives away some of his wealth. Like he doesn't give them a case study or hypothetical. He actually gives them something, and two servants do well, and one doesn't. Um, but I wonder if there's some degree of are we willing to give away some responsibility and then walk with folks and help them along that way? Because how else do we know if someone's ready for even more responsibility?
Mm,
So I think some of those things come to mind, but maybe the last thing that is top of mind for me right now is starting to see not just a leader, a potential church planter, a singular individual potential church planter or single household to be sent out, or maybe not an individual missionary household, but what would it look like for us to train teams?
mm,
Um, I love Tomy, and Tomy and I've gotten to interact in some ministry spaces before. And Tomy is wired incredibly differently than I am. And I'm a better leader when I know that Tomy is going to fill in some of the gaps that I have, some of the many, many gaps that I have. And I think of something that, is true for all of us. If a church has, just for the sake of numbers, say like there's 100 things that's necessary to lead an effective church, to lead a healthy church. I'm probably good at like three of them.
mm,
And Tomy's probably good at like 25 of them. And our friend Bill, who's on here, is probably good at 60 of them. And, like everybody's good at only a few things. My wife Jess is good at things that I'm not. Nicole, who's on our teaching team, is an amazing voice in a different voice than I have. And so every man, woman, and child, if they're in Christ, is gifted in some way for the upbuilding of the body.
mm,
And if that's true, then I wonder if some of the reason pastors and church planners and missionaries fry out and and become so overwhelmed and in missionary cases, that's one of the primary reasons missionaries come back to whatever country sent them. Is because we put way too much pressure on them to have to be everything. And so whether it's a missionary team or a church planting team, or frankly, I would love to see those two things become more similar than different. So a missionary church planting team, um, what would it look like for us to start to turn our eyes from training a single leader to go, or single household to go, single man or woman to go, to rather saying, hey, find a gifted team of differently skilled, differently spiritually gifted men and women and children, and send them together. And I think if we could see that happen, then it again turns it flips the script on there being, one hero leader, um, but rather it frees people to thrive in their giftings, trusting that there's other people to do the things that they're personally weak at.
Yeah. It reminds me of this podcast I was listening to this morning, and I haven't totally reflected on this, so people don't come after me for what I might say. But in listening to this podcast, it was talking about this idea that, people, individuals themselves, we try to make them well-rounded, but people actually, individuals should be sharp. And what you actually need is a well-rounded team.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really profound. I thought it was interesting. Like I said, I haven't totally reflected on that, so please don't come after me. Um, but as you're talking about the need to train and equip teams and to send teams, it just makes me think of that. Like, yeah, you gotta have people who are operating in their gift set and they're doing that to the best of that if God has designed them to do the full capacity of that. And of course, they're like developing competence in some of the areas that they're weaker in. But maybe that's the role of the team. The team can help sort of undergird and accompany blind spots and weaknesses. And so I am looking at these questions.
Yeah,
I don't know if we'll actually have time to get to all these, but there are some really good ones in here. And so I just love this question right here. Like, should going be based on a sending budget or on faith to be financed by the mission field? I think that's a fascinating question.
yeah,
And then they also ask the second question, should a church find its joy based on its vision goals from development of faith in its people, whether faith to step out into roles within or faith to step into the mission field without? And so
yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
yeah, yeah. And I think there's probably, this is going to sound like I'm punting. I think there's a both and to both of those questions. And so, yes, to all of it. No, Hilton, to your second question first. Should a church find its joy from development of its people stepping out, or stepping, ministering within? I think one leads to the other. I think that one of the things you see even in the church planting pattern of the Apostle Paul and his differently gifted team, back to what Tommy was just saying, is, they would go into a city, disciples would be made, disciples would gather, disciples would be trained up, and then some of them would step into leadership within their local church within their city, and then some of them would be sent out, to replicate the process in the next city. And so, Paul and whoever he was with at the time would go to the next city over and then make disciples, gather disciples, train disciples. Some would lead there, some would be sent out. And so I think that there's a within and without that are both really, really helpful and really, really necessary for the kingdom. If the only gifted leaders always go, then there's no one left to shepherd the flock that God has already established. And so, I think that is part of the discernment of a calling. We run a discernment lab for folks who are gifted in ministry, but they don't know if they should plant a church or be a succession plan pastor or go overseas for missions or that kind of stuff. And so there's a while where church planting was held up in the US as like that's the only varsity thing that ministers do. It's like, man, that is a really good thing that some should do, and also not the only thing that counts for gospel ministry. And so I do think that there's some who should bloom where they're planted and shepherd the flock of God that is already among them, and others that God would call and send out. And I think you see both of those examples in scriptures. Um, and it should go and be based on a sending budget or faith to be financed by the mission field. That's it's a unique question, and it's so situational. Um, I would love it if every sending church, uh, would find some way to fund at least some of the work. Again, my mind goes back to the image of a college student. Would it be great for a family to be able to pay for a kid's college, or does the college kid need to fund themselves? And the answer is probably so situational. It depends on so many different factors. And I will say that one of the realities that we're facing right now in the U.S. is that historically, it's been talked about that a traditional church plant needs 3 to 4 years to become self-sustaining financially. And so you see a lot of models and denominations and networks still that, year one, they're 100% funded from external, then 75%, 50%, 25. Um, the average church in the US right now takes 7 to 10 years to be fully internally funded. And that's not in like the quote unquote hard places. Folks in inner city post Christian environments, the stat is actually they're never fully funded. And so on some level, if it's going to be a more traditionally funded church with a budget and staff and this kind of stuff, then it's almost becoming utterly necessary, not just desire, but utterly necessary for a sending church or a group of churches, what we're trying to do in Fort Worth with Plant Fort Worth, saying our whole the church in the city is going to send out a church plant, not just an individual sending out a church plant. So it's almost necessary for there to be help for a longer time than we think from other churches and other organizations. Um, and then at the same time, of the 26 years that I've been in ministry, all of those have been bivocational, and so I've always worked some other job, whether it be a professor at a university or this kind of stuff. Currently, training other pastors and that sort of thing. And so the validity of a mission field or uh, a quote unquote less traditional in the Western mindset model of funding is also perfectly valid. I feel like I said a lot of words in that answer, and I don't know if any of it was helpful.
That's great. Cindy asked a really great question, but before, I mean, I don't know if we're gonna have time to get to it, but I did want to touch on, oh man, there's so many good questions in here. We had a question about uh, doing this with an older age church. I mean, I love that question because we talk about no matter the age of the church, it's important. But I think Josh, his second question and Jason's question
Yeah,
about, I just think they kind of go hand in hand, and so I'd
yeah, they
love
do.
to unpack this. And so. What gifts/skill sets do you look for in people that should take leadership roles in a new plant? And then Jason asked the question of like, where would you mobilize the APES framework within sent churches, sending churches culture?
Yeah. Yeah, to Jason's first, I think that goes back to what we were talking about as far as raising up a team of differently gifted people. I believe in the APES framework is a really helpful framework. And so what I don't believe is there has to be exactly 5 people and each one fits the specific category. Whenever we're trying to train planters or send out a church, we look a little bit more for like upward, inward, outward, or head, heart, hands. None of these are unique to us. But like, who are the folks who are constantly calling folks toward God and teaching scriptures? And of course, there's some overlap with the APES there. Who's the I was about to say who's the good shepherd? Jesus. Who's the most shepherdy gifted kind of person who's always caring for folks and making sure that hearts are there and care is happening across the body? And then who's the person who's always driving us toward mission? Um, and most people are gifted in one or two of those ways. No one, and I stand by this, people argue me. You can email Tomy if you don't like what I'm about to say. Um, most of us are gifted in one or two of those ways. No one's gifted in all those ways. Some of us can do the thing we're weak at, but man, it's wearying and tiring. And so then to Josh's question, the gift or skill set that people uh, who lead a church should have, I don't think there's just one. I think that if we can be comfortable in who God has made us to be, then it tells us who we need to come alongside us. And so for like Tomy and I think could plan a really good church together. Because Tomy has got a great shepherd's heart. He's a wise, thoughtful guy. He thinks before he speaks, which is something I need to continue to learn from him. But if I'm more driven toward like the head and hands, like I know that if we're going to plant a church, if I'm going to form a team, I need someone who's just really gifted in the heart, both for my own heart and then to give more well-rounded leadership to the ministry we're going to pursue together. And so I think that the gifts and skill sets um, are less about what is the one gift that's needed to plant and more about discerning what is your gift, what are you good at, and then who are you going to bring along with you to fill in the gaps and create a more holistically rounded church. So I think that's a little bit of a shared answer to both those questions.
Love that. So we got maybe about 5 minutes left.
I'll
And
mention the older church real quick.
yeah.
I love that question. The average age is 78 in your church. So how does this look? I love the heart of that question. Two things come to mind. One, just yesterday, I met a gentleman who's leading an organization who are planting. I assume they would be micro churches given the context, but they're planting churches in senior living centers. Um, and it started with this great story of him having to move a family member into a senior living center and realizing what a forgotten population that is. Um, and this is certainly true in my city. I don't know about everybody who's watching and listening, but realizing like that's a forgotten generation, and especially if they've been moved into a facility like that, that they're in a community, but doesn't mean they automatically have community. And so his hope is to start churches within senior living facilities. And he said the best people to reach seniors are seniors, like resonates with like. So that's one thought that comes to mind. And then the other is outside of just post college. This is U.S. stats, but outside of post college, um, the second the second the second largest age group for sending missionaries overseas from the U.S. is retirees. And there's something about having the flexibility, maybe have some accumulated finance so that they don't have to raise as much support, that kind of stuff. But the heart of the question, what I hope is somewhat clear, and the heart of the answer is saying just because someone's 78 doesn't mean they're done. Like as
Mm.
long as God has given us breath in our lungs, what would it look like at least to love our neighbors well? Um, and maybe God would have something more for us, depending on health and situations and that kind of stuff.
I love that. Let's see, 327. Are we feeling bold and ambitious? Should we go for one more or should I wrap it?
We're ambitious. Two questions are similar. What's the smallest that a church has that I've seen a church send? I've seen churches send in healthy ways when they're about 40 people strong. And does it look different than the church that would send out 40 people? Absolutely, it does. And does it take a little bit more backfilling? Yes. Does it mean they're not sending out with as much resource? Yeah, it looks a little bit different church to church, but to the specific question, I've seen smaller than expected churches send out in a very healthy way. And then same thing for the church of 150 to 75 in attendance. How would you prepare to send a church? Um, that's a lot of what we walk through in the book, frankly, but it would start with starting to cast a vision for sending, and then building a culture around that and putting a lot of your eggs in that basket, talking about it until you're sick of talking about it, because only then will people hear it for the first time.
Mm. Yeah. Well, uh, Ben, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way? Because I know we didn't answer all the questions here. And
Mhm.
so if people want to follow up with you, where should they email you at?
Yeah. Ben at equippinggroup.com. Equipping has two P's and there's two G's between equipping and group, so it's confusing. But Ben at equippinggroup.com. And I think we're going to capture some of these questions that we didn't get to, so hopefully we'll be able to follow up. But I'm happy to, if there's any way that we can help serve, or if you asked a question that didn't get answered, I'd be happy to engage on that. Probably
Awesome.
next week for the record if you're watching this live. But
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much for giving your time and your attention. Thank you so much for being faithful in writing this resource for the church in general. Uh, I just think it's such a tremendous blessing to all of us. And so I am personally grateful, and just always, yeah, just appreciative of when people say yes to Jesus on behalf of the bride and like, I don't know, serve the bride well. And I think you do that very, very, very well. And so if you're looking at this webinar, you're watching, you're wondering, what do we go from here? What do we do? There are a few next steps that you can take. So our encouragement, of course, is download the book. I believe you can download that from for free at exponential.org. And it sounds like if you want like a physical copy or something else, you can get it off of Amazon. So it is available there too. So that is one thing that's available for you. Along with the book, there are some exercises and resources that church leaders and teams have made. And so you can go to sentchurches.com. That is sentchurches.com, and you can get access to those exercises and resources that Ben alluded to, and accompany the book as well. And then, of course, I mean, Exponential has the global conference that is coming up. And so I believe physically it's already sold out. Like it's yeah, Exponential is just booming. So sorry, but you
But there's
can.
overflow
There
tickets,
is
so you can.
overflow and digital
Yeah, that's
tickets.
right.
So you can go to exponential.org, I believe, and get a hold of those. And so if you're wondering what to do, there's plenty of things that you can do. And so I
Do you
appreciate you
speak
guys giving up
exponential,
your
Tommy?
time and being a part of this webinar, witnessing it, watching it, and interacting with us. And guys, Ben, once again, thank you so much for being on this.
My pleasure. And if you are at Exponential Global, I'll be there. I don't know if Tommy's going to be there. He should be there. He lives close enough. So we would love to see you there as well. But truly, thank you for zooming in. I feel a little like sinus fog and I'm on some medication. So hopefully all the words that I said, at least a few of them made sense. But really honored to spend this hour with you and hope that God would use this time to produce disproportionate fruit by his power alone for the sake of his kingdom.
Amen. Amen. So have a great day, guys.